So you want to grab some more bulk wool and you want to place it onto your brush mat so it's covering the entirety of the brush mat, and then felt it down using your 7 needle multi-tool. Now here we're going to be creating our duck bill, and this is going to create the top half of our duck bill. So you don't need to worry too much about it being too thick. You want it to be thick enough that you'll be able to use your embroidery scissors in a moment to cut a shape out. So you don't want it overly thin, but you do want it to have, a little bit of thickness to it, but nothing too drastic, because we are going to be adding more wool in a moment to create more of a shape for our duck bill. So I'm just going over both sides now to create more of a felt sheet, and then I'm going to take the template for the top half of the duck bill and I'm just going to cut round it with my embroidery scissors so I've got that shape in the wool. Now you don't need to worry too much if it's slightly on the wonk here, because we can correct that later. Obviously if it's really wonky that won't work and you're going to struggle to correct that, but as you can see here it's not quite symmetrical, but I'm not too worried because I'm going to sort that out in a moment. So I'm just taking some more of my core wool and I'm just going to felt that down, and then I'm going to make another sheet, and this is going to create the lower half of the duck bill. So I'm not using as much this time because I know that my template for the lower half is slightly smaller than the top half, so it doesn't need to be as big, but it's a similar kind of thickness at the moment. So I'm taking the second template and doing exactly the same thing and just using my embroidery scissors to chop round it. So I'm just going to hold this into place and make sure proportion wise that everything's working, which it is. That's looking good to me. So I'm just taking some more of that core wool and I'm felting it over the top half of the bill, and then I'm just folding those loose ends over onto the other side. And this, like we were doing in module 1, is just to seal those sides in so you don't get any fraying or anything like that. So it just makes one solid piece of felt. So I'm just folding that side over. Don't worry too much about lumps and bumps at the moment, we can get rid of those, and we're going to add quite a bit of wool onto this to create that duckbill shape. So just getting rid of those cheeky bits of looseness. Don't worry too much about it being overly neat because we are going to be putting an orange top coat on this in a moment, but so you don't want it to be really rough and ready. Now that looks about right to me, so let's move on to the lower half of the bill and do exactly the same thing. So just placing that core wool over the top, felting it down over the piece that you've already cut out, and then just pulling over those loose ends onto the other side of the piece. I would say here I've maybe got a little bit too much wool, so don't be afraid to remove some if you find you've got a bit too much, like I am doing here, because whilst we don't need to worry too much about it being even at the moment, you don't want to have any really obvious bulk that wouldn't be consistent with the shape we're trying to create. So just tear away any excess wool that you feel is too much. So I'm just going to continue to fold over those loose edges and felt them down onto the other side of the duckbill. What you don't want as well, if you've got too much wool that you're folding over, is that you'll end up with a very thick duckbill, and it's going to be very difficult for you to use your multi-tool to then felt it all down. It can be quite a struggle, not so much with a single needle or a double needle, but because you've got those 7 needles together, it's like anything, if you have more of something, it makes it more difficult to do. So just be aware of that, and don't be afraid to tear some of that excess wool away if you do have too much. So I'm just felting down on the other side now, just to ensure that we've got a nice solid base to add our additional bulk wool onto later on when we're creating our duckbill. And now I'm going to move back to the top bill, and I'm just taking some layers which are roughly about 1/2 inch in width by about 3.5 inches in length, so they go past the top and bottom of our bill horizontally, or vertically, should I say, vertically. And I'm just going to use my double medium needles now to felt those down into place. And what we want to create is almost like a hill kind of shape. So it's raised in the middle and then it slopes downwards as you go towards the outer sides of the duckbill. The other thing that you want to be doing here is making the top part of the duckbill, so where it's going to be felted onto the head, narrower than the bottom part in relation to where you're adding that bulk wool. So it's almost like a funnel where you've got the smaller end at the top and then it funnels down to a larger piece at the bottom. And when you look at duckbills, you can see how this happens. So it's worth having a look on something like Pinterest or on Google Images, just so you can get an idea in your head of the kind of thing that you're aiming for. But you should be able to start to see here, as I'm adding the wool, how you need it to look. And I'm going to use my fingers just to press things into place, just to create that shape and make my life a little bit easier as I go through. So initially there I used about 4 to 5 layers of wool. It can take quite a few layers to really get that shape defined, but you can go as defined and over the top as you want with this. It's your sculpture, so go with what you feel your duckbill needs to look like. But what I'm doing here is I'm just felting the sides more, so I've got that really defined slope. And at the same time getting rid of any looseness, because we want this to be nice and solid so that when we add our top coat later on, it's going to be a really easy job to get that felted down nice and smoothly. So I'm just going to felt those loose pieces over the side, and now I'm going to speed things up because you've seen me do it once now. You don't need to see me do it in real time again because you'll be falling asleep. And we have a term in the UK in the medical profession where they say, see one, do one, teach one. And I think that's quite a good way of learning. So you've seen me do it, and now you're gonna do it yourself, and then you can show another felter how to do it. So it's a really straightforward technique. So I'm just felting again another layer into the centre part of that duckbill, folding over those ends. When you're folding over on the back, try not to have too much excess wool that you're folding over, because you'll create unevenness on that reverse side, which we don't want. And we can correct it, but ideally you just want to get it as smooth as possible. So I'm just using my needles just to press that duckbill inwards and create a bit more shape, so it's going inwards slightly at the sides as well, and also just felting along the edges of that extra piece of wool we've added down the middle. So you can see what I'm doing, just to form that more defined shape, that hill-like shape that I mentioned to you earlier on. So what I'm going to start doing now is also I'm going to start bending the duckbill into shape, just to train the wool, as you can see here, so that when I come to add it to my duck face in a moment, it's not going to be really wool bound, so we can start shaping it into the position we want it to be in, because at the moment it's just flat. And we don't want it to be flat because that will look really strange. So we need to start manipulating it and bending it so that it looks natural when we add it into place in a moment. So it's worth just giving it a bit of a bend, about sort of roughly 3/4 of the way to the sort of the from the bottom going upwards. Just bend that top half, as you can see, which I did in the video a moment ago. So I'm just adding another layer of the bulk wool again, slightly wider this time, just to create that smoother finish more than anything. I don't mind adding a little bit more wool to the side. You may choose to do it slightly differently, but I'm happy that I can afford to make those sides a bit thicker without jeopardising the shape I've already made. The thing you don't want to do is just keep adding layers over the entire thing, because then you're just going to end up with a solid, shapeless 2D flat item. So you want to continue to kind of add more wool to the middle part, but if you want to add a bit more to the sides as well to get that slightly thicker, that's absolutely fine. So I'm just going to fold over those edges again. And if you find that you do have a bit of extra wonky bulkiness on the back end, don't worry too much. We can just add some more felt to the back later on and give it a bit more of a firmer felt to get those bulky areas out. And I'm sticking with my medium needles here. You can choose to go over to your fine needles if you prefer. I think you'll find that the medium needles are work a lot more quickly than the fine needles, but you might find that as the piece gets a bit thicker, the fine needles are easier to use, felting everything into place and shaping it. So you can see here that I'm starting to get this very raised area at the top half of the bill, and then the lower half is splaying out in that funnel-like shape that I explained to you at the beginning, and is just not quite as raised. So I'm just felting that down at the bottom half of his bill there. And I'm just going around using my needles around the side of the bill to try and get a bit more symmetry. You know how I said at the beginning, don't worry too much if it's a bit wonky. Well, this is why you don't need to worry too much, because we're just going to shape it as we go with our needles around the side. So it's honestly not a problem. But remember just to kind of take a step back every now and then and have a look at it, just to make sure that it does look symmetrical, and use that technique of taking a photograph, which is a really valuable trick to getting that symmetry in all of your sculptures. Now, I think that I'm pretty much there now in terms of the shape that I want to create for my duck bill. You can see on the video how you've got that centre part which is raised up. So the next thing I'm going to do is take my wool bats, my orange wool bats, my top coat, and I'm just going to felt that using my 2 fine needles, my fine twisted needles, and just felt that over the initial core element of the duck bill that we've already created. And then you just want to start felting from the inside out, like I've said many times within this course, to felt down your top coat of wool. And then if you've got any straggly ends, just felt them over onto the other side, and then we can cover that later. But it's pretty straightforward, this part. All we're doing is just covering what we've already created with our chosen colour. And you can get all sorts of really beautiful colours in terms of the oranges. So have a look online and see what options are out there. I've gone with this lovely kind of carrot coloured orange, but there are lots of other burnt oranges and lighter oranges out there which also might look really cool. You don't even have to go with orange, you could go with a completely different colour altogether and add another dynamic to your duck face. It can make it look really cool and really stand out. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the purple cow, but essentially they use the purple cow analogy when they're talking about branding. So you want to be a purple cow in a field of brown or black and white cows, i.e. you really want to stand out and grab people's attention, because if I saw a purple cow in a field, I'd be like, oh my god, that's a purple cow. And that's what you want to do in your sculptures. So by creating something different that stands out, you are, without sounding overly cheesy, the purple cow. So you really want to focus on getting your designs and your colours. Colours are really important because they really speak to people. You really want them to stand out and grab people's attention. But even if you had a piece, so say you created a collection of duck heads and all of them you did something different to and they all looked pretty funky, but there was one that you did which was really outrageous, and maybe you've chosen really bright colours and like bold colours like reds and bright pinks and really clashy colours, and it's in a shop and someone sees it and thinks, oh my god, that's absolutely horrendous on my eyes and I don't like it. Yes, they might not like it, but it's standing out to them and someone will like it, and it's a talking piece and it will get people talking about your other pieces, especially if you have more than one piece in the shop. Now, I'm not saying create things that people don't like, that's not what I'm saying, but what I'm saying is you really want your pieces to stand out, and even if it gets a bad reaction from someone, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's good to get people's attention because that's what gets people talking, especially if you're putting things on places like Pinterest, which are evergreen platforms. It can really grasp people's attention and get them talking. Put it on Reddit and places like that and you'll get your name known. So don't be afraid to play with colours and really put your stamp on something and put your personality into it. That is so important in any art form. If you make it bland and follow everybody else, you won't be the purple cow for a start. But it's just going to blend into the background. There's going to be nothing that's different that really grabs someone's attention. So it's so important to go with your personality, go with, something that makes people's eyes go pop. not literally because that would be quite messy, but something that really stands out to people and kind of gives them an emotion, whether it's a good emotion or a bad emotion. It gives them that emotion and it makes them remember you. So I just thought I'd go off on my little soapbox there and have a bit of a rant about that, but it's a really important thing to bear in mind when you're designing and creating any collections and sculptures. So it's just something to have a think about. So we're getting there with our top half of our duckbill. Again, I'm just moving that into place and manipulating it to get it into the position I want it to be for when I add it to the duck's head in a moment. And just getting that nice solid edge as well. You really want to have your edges nice and solid because again, it's giving you a good anchor to add it to your duck's head. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to actually felt this onto our duck. And I'm positioning it roughly about halfway down the duck head, probably a little bit under halfway. And the reason for that is I want to leave some space for our eyes. I don't want to have the eyes too far up the head because then it'll look a bit odd. And all I'm doing is I'm holding the bill against the head and I'm lifting it up so about a quarter of the bill is in contact with the head and then the rest is lifted upwards, and then I'm using my fine twisted needles to felt downwards, so I'm felting into the top of the bill and then into the head to get that secured into place. You could use glue, but it won't look as good because you won't have that consolidation of the two pieces merging together. The duck is very, the glue will make something look very surface based, so you'll never get that shaping there like you would if you're using, like we are here, our needles. So don't feel tempted to glue it because it won't look as good. So it can take a bit of time to felt this down because you want to make sure that it is really solid and it's not going anywhere. You also want to keep checking to make sure that it's also straight and not wonky, otherwise he might look like he's had too many drinks maybe. I'm trying to think of a drinking duck pun, but I can't think of any at the moment. So just want to keep felting down those sides as well. And when we add the other half of the duckbill in a moment, we can then continue to shape. Don't felt the top too much in terms of pushing it downwards because you'll lose that lovely shape that you've already created, but you do want to felt into those side areas quite a bit to get that all felted down nicely, as you can see I'm doing here in the video. So I would recommend just giving it a little wiggle every now and then, and you'll be able to feel how firm it is. And because I was sending this to New Zealand as well, I was ultra paranoid about ensuring that this was really solid because I didn't want it to become loosened in the post or damaged in any way, and it had quite a journey on its hands, so I wanted to ensure that it was all intact for when the receiver received her or received him. So I'm just going underneath now as well, and I'm just raising the duckbill so it's lifted up slightly, and I want it to be a little bit lifted, almost like it's kind of smiling. And then I'm using those dents that we've created, where we've created that hill shape in the middle. I'm using those also as an anchor point to felt into the head to create more security so that the bill is felted into place. And I'm just going to felt up again. Go careful if you do this, obviously there's a risk that you might stab yourself, so just be cautious. And I'm just felting underneath just to give it an extra level of anchorage so that it's nice and solid. And you can see we've got a lovely thick duck lip. Still don't know what the technical term is for it. I should really probably Google it or ask Siri or something. So I'm just going to shape it a bit now. So I'm going into the sides and I'm going in on a horizontal angle, so I'm still making contact with both the duckbill and the duck head, but I'm just pushing that duckbill inwards ever so slightly at the sides to create more shaping for it, so it's not just completely linear in how it sits on our duck head. I'm all for creating lots of shapes and curves. I don't like linear and flat. I just find it not as exciting. So we're going to make the lower half of our bill now, and we're going to do exactly the same thing with the other side. So just adding our orange wool bats over the top and felting it all down into place. Now you could consider using your brush mat and your needle multi-tool to felt this orange wool in place a lot more quickly. But I think what you'll find, and certainly what I found, is that it's too thick now. And like I said earlier, the thicker the piece, the harder it is to felt down with that 7 needle multi-tool. And whilst it's very quick and it's very good at doing things in volume that are flat, it's very difficult to create that shape that you would get with a single or a double needle. And that's why I'm using my double needles, just to give me that flexibility of creating more shape, but it's also easier to felt that orange wool down onto it as well. So as I'm felting everything down and looking for any bits of looseness, I'm also checking for any areas where there might be some white shining through that I might need to then cover up again. So I'm just going to take a bit more orange wool and place it over the top once more, and then just felt it down too. And then really we haven't got much more to do once this is in place, and this is probably the most complicated part of the tutorial. It really is a very straightforward design, and once you've done this, all we need to do is add our eyes in, and we're pretty much there. It's created. And like I said earlier on in this tutorial, you can then start playing with it. Once you've got the basic structure and look of your duck and you've mastered that, you can start creating all sorts of ducks. You could do a pirate duck, princess duck, Freddie Mercury duck, whatever you want really. So I'm just positioning the lower half of the duck bill underneath, and you want it to be less proud of the top lip. So you want it to be roughly, I'd say, about 1.5 centimetres to 2 centimetres back from where the top lip protrudes, if that makes sense. So you should have this piece that I'm felting down here, which I've bent so that it's in contact with the duck's head, and it just enables me to felt it into place. And I'm just felting down those sides, because the sides and those corner edges are the areas where it can not look very cohesive and it can stick out a bit. So you want those areas to be nice and firmly felted into place, but it also gives me an opportunity to shape it a bit more as well. Whilst I was making this duck, in my head I just had, I don't know if anyone, especially people that were kind of around in the 80s, remember the film Howard the Duck. I just had that song in my head, and they called him Howard the Duck. So that's what I had in my head whilst I was making my duck head. So continue to just keep felting down those sides, and also really focusing, it's difficult to see on the camera, but this underside here as well, you really want to focus on felting that down too. And then we can start playing with the mouth and putting it into some form of a shape. So we can have it slightly open or slightly smiling, or even slightly frowning if you want it to be frowning. An interesting marketing thing for you though, I've found recently, I've spoke to a few shopkeepers that I was selling my products with, and I sell some mouse mobiles, and some smile and some look quite surprised. They have this kind of like open mouth look to them, and the smiling mice always sell much better than the surprised mice. So I think if you're creating creatures and animals in your needle felting, unless it's a scene that you're creating, a smiling sculpture sells better than a frowny sculpture. But it depends on the context of what you're making as well. If you're kind of creating something ironic, you might not want it to be smiling. Say for instance, if you wanted to create this duck head like it's just been shot by Elmer Fudd or something like that, and he's got that kind of surprised look on his face and can add a bit of a comedy value to it, then maybe you don't want him to be smiling. But smiling things do tend to sell better, I've found in my personal experience. So I'm just going down that side again, getting my needles in there, and then just going round the whole entire thing, lifting up that top part of the bill and raising up a bit more as well to create more of a duck bill shape. And then just going around that lower part again. And just keep positioning and moving things until you're happy with how they're sat, and also just give them a little wiggle, like I said, just to ensure that they are solidly felted down and they're not going to come unstuck very easily. especially when little hands get hold of them as well. If a little pair of hands start tugging at things, you want to make sure they're nice and solid and it's not going to be pulled apart really easily. And I speak from experience there, and I'm sure many of you will know exactly what I mean. So my little 5-year-old, she's always saying to me, "Mummy, can I touch it?" And you're like, "No, do not touch it with your filthy hands, child." Bless her. Sometimes I let her touch them, but not the ones that I'm selling, because she does have a tendency to take things too far and start pulling things. Okay, so now we're at the stage where we can add our eyes, and because you've got a fair bit of squidge left in your head, or you should do, just use your fingers to mark out where you want your eyes to be. And that way then, if you're thinking, "Oh, I'm not too sure about that," you can always move them, let the wool rise up again, and then just move them. But I think that position that I've chosen there, where I've used my fingers to create that initial indentation, looks quite natural and looks quite good, and is reminiscent of that rubber duck head that I'm trying to create. Now just keep using my fingers just to press it into position, and then I'm just using my fine needle still just to felt an indentation down into the duck head. We don't want to put our eyes on flat, because again you're getting that really linear finish, which I'm not a fan of, because I think it takes away from the realism or the realisticness of the sculptures that we're trying to create, and it doesn't give such a natural finish. So I think it's important to have those indentations there. So now I've got some white Gotland wool bats, and I'm just taking some relatively small pieces, obviously larger than we have been using for our eyes because the sculpture's that much larger, and I'm just going to place them equal amounts into the indentations that I've created. And then I'm just going to use my fine needles again to felt that into place. And I'm just using that indentation as a guide for where the wool is going to go. So working my way around the outside, and then you'll find that the wool naturally retracts inwards into the eye area. So as you keep going round in almost like a circular motion, and you can just bring those extra bits of wool that are looking a bit rough and ready, as you can see on the video, just bring those in using your needle over into the centre of the eye, just to tidy it up and get a nice rounded finish to your eye. But if it doesn't look quite right, don't worry, because we're going to add a little bit more white wool in a moment anyway. It's just to get that initial rough shape so that you've got something to work with then and create more of a rounded duck eye that we all recognise on a rubber duck. So I'm just using my needle, using your needle in a sort of sidewards horizontal angle to tidy things up and push things inwards is a really good way of getting a nice, neat, spherical finish to your eye. And once you've got this one in place, you've then got something to work on to copy on the opposite side. So just working around those edges again, getting it nice and rounded. It doesn't have to be a perfect shape, it can be a bit of an oval. You can go with whatever you think. It doesn't even have to be a circle if you don't want it to be a circle. You could make an eye like we've been making in our sort of earlier tutorials when we were making animals, and we made more sad eyes and more of those almost Pixar style eyes. So you don't have to feel like you need to stick rigidly to this tutorial. Don't let this tutorial take away any creative ideas that you might have. I'm just keeping it nice and simple for you at the moment, so then you can really expand on it. So I've now finished both eyes, as you can see, again in true Blue Peter style. And what I'm doing here is I've got my fine needles and I'm felting in the gap between the yellow and the white wool. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I want to create almost like a kind of dip between the two. So it looks like that the white of the eye is really embedded into the head of the duck. It's again a way of making things look less linear, less 2D, and creating a bit more shape around them. And you can see, and it's a very subtle finish, but you can see with the needles here how I'm doing it. It does give the duck eyes a bit more of a realistic finish to them. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take my black wool and we're going to add our pupils in. So this is kind of like when we made our mouse and did the mouse eyes, but on a bigger scale. So you want to ensure that the proportions of the wool that you're using are roughly even. So feel free to take two similar pieces and roll them between your fingers and just check how they feel and make sure they feel roughly the same. I'm just putting this in place here to see how big I want my pupil to be roughly. Now you could make your pupil quite large if you wanted to, and I'm going to position my pupil probably inwards and central, but you could have him kind of looking in different directions to make him look a bit odd, a bit kooky, or you could have him looking to the side. I really like the idea of having two of these duck heads and them looking at each other on the wall. I think that looks really cool as a piece. So that's something that you might want to do with your work when you come to make any taxidermy type sculptures in the future. So I've positioned the black wool into place and I'm just going to lightly start felting it down now. And once again, we want to manipulate the wool so that we can get it into a rounded shape. So just take your time with this, and you really want to be using your needles on that side angle to push that black wool inwards so you don't have any residue bits of fluff going over the whites of your eyes. You want it to be a nice clean line. So I'm just pulling that wool inwards to get that nice rounded clean finish. And like when we were adding the initial base for our eye a moment ago, the white, and it retracted as we felted it into the middle, the black is going to do the same thing. So be very cautious that you don't felt too much in the middle of the black, because what you'll find is that it will retract so much that it will get quite small, and then it won't be in proportion with the rest of your duck eye and then obviously the duck head. So just ensure that as you're doing it, it's not getting too small, and just keep looking around the sides to get that nice rounded shape. So I'm going to speed it up for the second eye, as you've already seen me do it once, just to get that all felted down, and just keep checking to make sure that the opposite side looks roughly the same size as the first one that you felted in. So I'm just bringing those fluffy edges in again to get that nice clean circular finish. And it's lovely, the contrast of the black against the white really stands out. I'm just going to felt round that a bit more to get that a bit more rounded. Give it a press. I think it just needs a bit more felting that side. Just going round those edges again to tidy it up, and the same on the other side. And also remember that if it retracts too much, you can also push it outwards. So using your needles on the inner edge of the black, and then on a sort of diagonal, felt it outwards to create a larger area. So if you do find that it goes in a bit too much, just do as I'm doing here, pushing the wool outwards to get that nice circular finish that looks nice and symmetrical, because we love symmetrical on this course. I wonder if you added it up how many times I say symmetrical. Okay, so we've got to the stage where we've got our black in our eyes, and now we're going to add the light in his eyes. And this is the bit that I always find, as I said in the mouse tutorial, that really transforms the sculpture into something that looks a bit like an inanimate object to something that looks like it could be alive and talk to us. So I'm just taking equal amounts of the white wool, and we're still using the Gotland wool bats here, and I'm just using my fingers again to just check if they are roughly the same size, it's roughly the same amount of wool, and I'm going to position them in the inner central part of the black of the eye. And I'm just swapping over to my medium singular needle now, because the double needles are a bit too large to create that nice circular finish that I want to have within the duck eyes. So I would swap over at this point to a singular needle to do this section of the tutorial, just to give you a bit more precision when you're doing the kind of the whites of the eyes, the light. Just continue to felt using your single needle until you get to the stage where, once again, they both look symmetrical and you're happy with the size of the whites of your eyes. And if you find, again, that it's too small, just use your needle to push that wool outwards, or you could always add a little bit more white wool as well if you want to create something a bit larger. So all I'm doing now is I'm using my fine needles to create eyebrows, or almost like a brow, furrowed brow for our duck, to give him a bit more personality. So I'm just taking my fine needles and going in like a reverse rainbow, so a slight kind of frowny look for him just above his eyes to make him look a bit kind of surprised, I guess. Because of the thickness of the head, it will take a bit of a time to get to the point where that indentation is really visible, especially as it's an indentation and you're not using another colour to create the eyebrow. So just be patient, but you will get a nice indentation if you take your time. And there you have it. That is your faux taxidermy rubber duck. So I can't wait to see your taxidermy ducks. I think they will all look absolutely quacking. Oh dear. But they should sit wonderfully on the wall and really add a eye-catching piece for people that come and have a look at him. So I hope you're pleased. I know they're going to look absolutely amazing, and I will see you in the very next tutorial. So that is your rubber duck head made. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please like it, and please share it with your friends as well, or anybody that you know that's interested in needle felting, because I really want to get my videos out there to all people that are interested in starting needle felting and just don't know where to start and want some fun tutorials to work on. Please subscribe to my channel as well, because I'm posting 3 days a week at the moment, on Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays. I will see you on Friday next week with another needle felting tutorial. Until then, have a wonderful day, and I will see you very, very soon. Bye.